In the last 2 weeks, the feds have rolled out 2 big housing announcements and met with the 5 big grocery store CEOs, and separately then with the CEOs of their food suppliers, promising a plan to stabilize food prices by Thanksgiving. Summertime polls showed Canadians felt Liberals were behind the ball on addressing affordability. So are these recent announcements going to change that narrative? Let's bring back the front bench. Elliott Hughes, Gary Marr, Anne McGrath, and Laura Stone. Gary, I'll start with you. Elliott made a great point to kind of conclude our last segment, which is they had this very significant announcement yesterday, which is all you can see has been well received, among developers and things like that. But it was completely overshadowed. They announced it half an hour prior to the speaker actually resigning. So every single question from reporters was about whether or not that would actually happen. Do you think the strategy is kind of hindered by things like that, or might it eventually start changing the narrative I talked about in the introduction?
Well, I remember maybe a couple of weeks ago, or maybe 3 weeks ago, Elliott and Anne and I were talking about, communication strategy, and it didn't strike me as being a very good sort of timing for this announcement, which I agree it's a good news announcement, but nobody was interested in it because of the superseding issues with respect to Speaker Rota. Look, a number of these announcements by the federal government do strike me as being stealing part of the campaign platform of the Conservatives who were running on issues in the last election. But it is very difficult for the housing market to catch up. So, for example, here in the city of Calgary, 17,000 housing starts were in 2022. That's a record number. But in the first half of this year, 51,000 people moved to the city of Calgary. So there's always going to be a lag. The market will respond as the market does to demand. But there are a whole host of issues ranging from supply chain to human capital. So it's not just about money. It's a whole host of things, some of which are in the federal government's purview to assist and some of which are not. So as an example, developers are putting they're putting caveats on properties that say you can't have a laneway house on this piece of property. That's something that the federal government can't change. It's not something that the municipalities can change either. But this is a very challenging issue. But as Olivia Chow says, the federal government does have to work with municipalities.
I think to Gary's point, and the difficulty in landing this stuff politically, particularly around housing, is the lag time, right? Like, in order for us to see the tangible results, it's going to be over a longer period of time. There's no way in and around that at this point. It doesn't, negate the criticism that a lot of this stuff could have been announced earlier, but it's still the truth about kind of measuring the political impact. On the grocery store stuff, do you think they might have more success if they are able to come in a few weeks and say, hey, there's this plan to make, let's say, 5 food items that you all buy a little bit cheaper?
Well, from what I heard about the grocery, it is true. And I thought that Mayor Chow made a really good point about the fact that that some of the housing stuff is long term, but there are things that can be done in earlier, and I think that that's really practical and really important. On the groceries, I think that from what I've heard anyway, it's meeting with the grocery giants and basically kind of scolding them a bit and asking them to come up with a plan to stabilize, not lower prices. So they're not being asked to lower prices.
And I got an answer last week about what that means. Stop going up, the finance minister said.
But it's not about them not going up. It's about bringing them down. The price of so many goods right now are just so high, and it is all that people are talking about in grocery stores. Mm-hmm. So, I would really encourage members of the government to go spend a little bit more time in grocery stores and see what people are saying when they're picking up the items. But, this idea that you can, and I think it's actually both in the housing and in the grocery issue, I worry about an over-reliance on market forces. And market forces alone are not going to be able to bring down the price of housing or the price of groceries. They have to look at other things. So when we talk about housing, it has to be about more homes, rental, condos, houses, etc., but they have to be affordable. So right now what's happening is there are some apartments being built, for instance, that nobody can afford to live in. That does not help. Same with groceries. As I said before, if they stabilize the prices where they are now, it's not affordable right now. So stabilizing them doesn't help all that much.
So I have a kind of crass political question for you then, Elliott. The merits of all of this are going to be discussed and measured, certainly. But is there some political success or potential success in just the fact that they are finally doing stuff and talking about doing stuff, and even the visual that they've presented, I've noticed in the past few press conferences of the big four primary ministers, you know, Minister Anand, Minister Champagne, Minister Freeland, and Minister Fraser, all coming out all together, and they've done it repeatedly over the past few weeks. Is there something to that?
I think there is, and I think the most important thing is that the government has actually started to try and do something. The important thing here, I think, is going to be a continued cadence of this type of announcement that you see from Minister Fraser. I think I've seen letters from him where he's getting involved in the real nitty-gritty, you know, 5-unit buildings being built in cities, and he's sending letters and talking about it. So I do think that showing that you are making the big announcements and showing that you care about the details will matter, but what will matter the most is this cadence and continuation and follow through, that you don't just talk about it today, tomorrow, next week, that you're talking about it week after week after week, because mostly you want to show people that you are doing something about it. That takes time for people to see, to feel, and to understand. And so this repetition, I think, is hugely important on not only this issue, but on other issues that you heard Ms. Chow talking about, who I think is delivering very sober, very frank, very easy to understand messaging that I think the federal government is going to have to really come to the table and deal with her on. I think she's a very strong voice for Toronto so far. She's run a very low-key, smart mayoral mayor's office to date. And I think she's been effective in her messaging. And for, again, if we're sticking with the politics, Toronto and the GTA and the folks who sort of listen to the media in that part of the world, in that part of the country, are, you know, going to be watching the federal government and expecting them. And there are huge, important voting blocks there for the federal government, for the Liberal Party particularly. So for me, it's watching whether the government can keep up what it has started over the last couple of weeks with some big announcements, but also following through and repeating those key messages to people so that it finally sinks in that they're doing something about it.
Do you think the feds will do something different when it comes to Toronto? Laura, I know more recently they had said, hey, the province has a surplus. You should be directing your questions for more money at them. And then this weird thing happened where Doug Ford's kind of said, okay, I acknowledge there's some structural problems. We'll form a working group. And do you think the feds, there will be pressure on them, and to Elliott's point, politically as well, given the significance of Toronto to them, to do more?
Yes, from unmitigated disaster to Doug Ford's BFF. That's what happened between Olivia Chow and the province. I actually find it really surprising that the federal government has seemingly taken such a hands-off approach to Toronto's requests so far. They really haven't engaged in the bailout discussions. They haven't suggested that they're going to join this working group between the province and the city, saying it's great that you two are working it out and that's the way that it should be. And look at all this money that we've funneled into Toronto previously. I don't know if the strategy here is that they're taking the city for granted. I don't know if they're concerned potentially about other municipalities coming and setting a precedent for very big bailouts or handouts, but I think they're going to have to get more engaged with the city of Toronto, and they really haven't done so far. And I think in order to kind of maintain the lead that they have within the urban Toronto setting and not lose those seats potentially to other parties in the next election, they're going to have to come forward and play ball much more than they have in the past few months.
We shall see. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for a great discussion. Appreciate it. Our front bench this evening, Elliott Hughes, Gary Marr in his wonderful mug, Anne McGrath, and